Russia is the largest country on Earth, spanning 11 time zones and sitting atop what may be the greatest treasure trove of natural riches ever amassed. By one estimate, Russia's natural resources are worth an astonishing $75 trillion, nearly double those of the United States. This single nation holds 25% of the world's natural gas reserves, along with colossal stores of oil, coal, minerals, timber, and gold. By all logic, such immense wealth should have made Russia one of the richest countries on the planet, perhaps even richer than America. And yet, the reality is strikingly different. The average Russian's income is only a fraction of the average American's, with GDP per person around $17,000 in Russia versus $89,000 in the United States. In total economic size, Russia's GDP of roughly $2.5 trillion is less than 1/10 of America's, trailing even smaller nations like Italy and France. How can a nation so rich in resources remain so relatively poor in outcome? Despite its superpower arsenal and vast lands, Russia's economy has long been dubbed a paradox of potential unfulfilled. It raises a tantalizing question. If Russia holds a vault of natural riches greater than any other country on Earth, why hasn't it translated into broad prosperity? Today, we explore the lost superpower, how an empire of riches became an economy of missed opportunities, and why Russia, by rights, should be far richer than it is. Our journey begins with the sheer scale of Russia's natural wealth, a $75 trillion vault beneath the soil. No other country comes close. Russia leads the world in natural resource value, outstripping even resource-rich giants like the US, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. This mind-boggling figure encompasses everything from vast petroleum and gas fields to metal ores and rare earth elements to endless forests of timber. To put it in perspective, $75 trillion is about 3/4 of the entire world's annual GDP. It's like having the output of the whole planet's economy in resources locked within one nation's borders. Consider just a few of Russia's superlatives. It holds the world's largest proven natural gas reserves, roughly 1.7 quadrillion cubic feet, which is nearly a quarter of all the gas known on Earth. It's the planet's second largest producer of natural gas, and, in recent years, either the first or second largest exporter of crude oil. In fact, Russia was the third largest oil producer in 2024, pumping out over 11% of global supply, on par with Saudi Arabia and the United States. Its coal reserves are among the world's biggest, and it's a top exporter of coal and wheat. Beneath Russian ground lies everything from diamonds. Russia produces approximately 39% of the world's industrial diamonds, to nickel, platinum, iron ore, uranium. You name it. Russia probably has it in abundance. By Statista's 2021 estimate, Russia's natural wealth, in dollar terms, even exceeds that of the United States by some $30 trillion. It's an almost counterintuitive reality. A nation with half the GDP of California owns more raw wealth than any global rival. This immense endowment has often been likened to a gigantic national savings vault, a store of value that, if properly harnessed, could fuel generations of prosperity. From the oil wells of Baku, fueling the lamps of Europe in the 19th century, to Siberian gas keeping modern Europe's homes heated, Russia's exports have been dominated by commodities. In 2021, oil and gas alone made up around 2/3 of Russia's export revenue, underpinning the federal budget and funding government programs. For decades, high energy prices have filled Russian state coffers. At one point in the 2010s, oil and gas revenues accounted for nearly 50% of the federal budget. By all indications, few countries have ever been as blessed by natural treasure as Russia is. Yet, for all its inherited wealth, Russia's economic story is not one of runaway success. Natural riches can be a blessing, but as we'll see, they can also be a curse if mismanaged. To understand why Russia isn't swimming in riches like a petrostate Scrooge McDuck, we must venture beyond the balance sheets of oil and gas and examine the economics and geopolitics of a resource superpower. There's a well-documented paradox in development economics, often called the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty. It observes that countries with abundant natural resources can, counterintuitively, end up growing more slowly and achieving lower incomes than those with far fewer resources. Russia, unfortunately, exhibits many classic symptoms of this curse. One key mechanism is something economists dub Dutch disease. This phenomenon, named after the Netherlands' experience after a 1960s natural gas boom, occurs when a surge in resource exports drives up a country's currency value, making its other exports, manufactures, agriculture, tech, less competitive on world markets. In effect, the resource sector crowds out the rest of the economy. In the 2000s, as oil prices soared, Russia's earnings in petrodollars caused the ruble to strengthen sharply. Easy money flowed into Moscow and St. Petersburg, but at the same time, Russian factories and mills found it even harder to sell their goods abroad. Why build diversified industries when exporting oil and gas is so lucrative? Over time, manufacturing and high-tech sectors stagnated, while the energy sector swelled to outsized importance. By 2012, more than 70% of Russia's export revenues came from oil, gas, and petroleum products. The economy grew dangerously one-dimensional. Boom times when oil was high, busts when oil fell. When the oil price crashed in 2014 and again in 2020, Russia's GDP and government budget were hit hard, showing how over-reliance on commodities made the country vulnerable to external shocks. Geography and logistics compound this resource trap. Russia's natural riches are literally buried in hard-to-reach places. Unlike, say, Saudi Arabia's conveniently located oil fields near coastal ports, much of Russia's oil and gas lies in the remote wilds of Siberia and the Arctic. Extracting and transporting these resources is hugely expensive and technically challenging. For example, giant gas fields like Bovanenkovo on the Yamal Peninsula sit above the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures plunge to -50 degrees Celsius, and permafrost turns construction into a feat of engineering. To move that gas to market, Russia built lengthy pipeline networks, thousands of kilometers westward to Europe, and now south and east to Asia. The Power of Siberia pipeline to China, for instance, stretches over 3,000 kilometers, traversing taiga, swamps, and mountains, an incredibly costly project just to deliver gas to paying customers. The sheer scale of Russia's landmass means moving resources to global markets is a logistics nightmare. Coal mined in eastern Siberia must be hauled thousands of kilometers on the Trans-Siberian Railway to reach a Pacific port. Oil from fields in Tatarstan travels by pipeline all the way to the Baltic Sea or Black Sea to find a tanker. Natural gas, historically, was trapped in pipelines pointing only toward Europe, a strategic vulnerability that became painfully clear in recent geopolitical showdowns. Additionally, much of Russia's coastline is locked in ice for significant parts of the year, limiting year-round shipping from its Arctic and Far Eastern ports. In short, Russia's geography isolates many of its resources, like a vault that's difficult to unlock. Exploiting these riches requires enormous capital investment, cutting-edge technology, and often foreign partnerships, factors not always readily available, especially under sanctions or during times of crisis. We also have to consider the human geography. Russia's population and economic centers are in the west, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and south, while the richest resource deposits lie in thinly populated north and eastern regions. This mismatch means labor shortages in the extraction zones and the need to import workers or draw people from cities to harsh environments. It's another hurdle to turning natural wealth into broad prosperity. So, the resource curse in Russia is partly an economic ailment, an overdependence on commodities that stifles other industries, and partly a geographic challenge, having a treasure chest buried under ice, literally. But there's a third, and perhaps most critical dimension to this curse, one that has nothing to do with physics or geography and everything to do with human factors: how institutions and governance handle, or mishandle, the nation's wealth. For that, we turn to Russia's institutions of theft. A country's natural resources can be a foundation for prosperity, if managed wisely. In places like Norway, as we'll discuss soon, robust institutions turned oil wealth into a blessing for the whole society. In Russia, however, much of the wealth has been siphoned off by a tiny elite or squandered through corruption, leaving ordinary citizens with a far smaller share of the bounty. Russia's modern history tells the tale. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Russian Federation undertook a rushed, chaotic privatization of state industries. In the feeding frenzy of the 1990s, vast oil fields, metal mines, and gas companies, assets that belonged to the Soviet state, ended up in the hands of a few well-connected businessmen for pennies on the dollar. These men came to be known as oligarchs, wielding both economic might and political influence. By the end of the 1990s, a handful of oligarchs controlled Russia's biggest oil companies, banks, and industrial empires, instantly becoming billionaires in a country where millions were impoverished. In the 2000s, President Vladimir Putin reined in some of these oligarchs, famously exiling or jailing those who challenged his authority, and redirected control of key resources to the state and a loyal circle of new oligarchs, often with security or government backgrounds. But this did not equate to broad redistribution. It simply shifted the beneficiaries. The Russian state, under Putin, became deeply intertwined with big business, often to the detriment of transparency and competition. Corruption and rent-seeking behavior flourished as insiders gained license to extract wealth without accountability. The statistics paint a stark picture of how concentrated Russia's wealth has become. As of 2021, just 500 super-rich Russians controlled 40% of the country's entire household wealth. Let that sink in. 500 people, in a nation of 146 million, own nearly half of everything. This concentration is 3 times the global average level of wealth inequality, making Russia one of the most unequal major economies on Earth. In fact, the richest 0.001% of Russians have more wealth than the bottom 99.8% combined. And while billionaires everywhere have a lot of money, in Russia, their influence on the overall economy is extreme. By one estimate, the wealth of Russia's billionaires amounts to roughly 20%, 1/5, of Russia's GDP, a share far higher than in the US or Europe. A huge slice of the national pie has effectively been carved out for a tiny elite. Where did this elite wealth come from? Largely from Russia's natural resource sectors, oil, gas, metals, and from industries monopolized or controlled through political connections. Corruption acts like a leak in Russia's $75 trillion vault. Money that should be funding schools, hospitals, or infrastructure often ends up in offshore bank accounts, luxury real estate in London and Dubai, or mega yachts anchored in the Mediterranean. The cost of corruption is difficult to measure precisely, but some estimates have put it at hundreds of billions of dollars per year. One analysis in the late 2000s suggested that graft and illicit financial flows effectively siphoned off the equivalent of up to 1/3 of Russia's GDP, a staggering drag on the economy. Even Russia's own accounting chamber has acknowledged that trillions of rubles are lost to misuse and embezzlement annually. In international rankings, Russia consistently scores near the bottom for clean governance. On Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, Russia scored only 26 out of 100 in 2023, with 100 being very clean, putting it in the same rough league as countries like Mali and Pakistan in terms of perceived corruption. This environment of graft and cronyism discourages foreign investment outside of extractive industries. Who wants to invest in a place where contracts aren't secure and bribes are the norm? It also means that huge projects, say building a new highway or spaceport, end up costing double due to kickbacks, or never quite materialize at all. Crucially, corruption and weak institutions have hollowed out the link between natural wealth and public welfare. For example, during an oil boom, a well-governed country might accumulate savings or invest in public goods. Russia did create oil reserve funds, but large portions were spent on prestige projects or drained by inefficiencies. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians saw modest benefits at best. Outside the big cities, many regions rich in oil or minerals remain surprisingly underdeveloped, a stark contrast to, say, the glittering cities of the Gulf petrostates or the comfortable prosperity of Norway. In some oil towns, one can see ultra-modern company facilities on one side of a road and run-down worker barracks on the other. This inequity fuels public frustration and a sense that the system is rigged, which, arguably, it has been. Another way institutions failed is through the massive capital flight Russia experienced. Instead of reinvesting profits at home, many of the rich and powerful simply sent their money abroad to safer havens. It's estimated that around $1 trillion of capital has been pulled out of Russia since the fall of the USSR, essentially wealth that fled the country in search of stability or secrecy elsewhere. That's money that could have built factories in Russia, financed startups, or improved public services, but instead is funding villas in the south of France or padding bank accounts in Switzerland. So, when we ask why Russia remains relatively poor despite its riches, a huge part of the answer lies here. the institutions of theft and mismanagement. Natural resources create vast wealth, yes, but in Russia's case, much of that wealth has been diverted by corrupt governance and unequal structures. The result is an economy where potential is high on paper, but performance lags in practice. The vault is full, yet the vault's keepers have left the door open or helped themselves before the riches could reach the broader population. However, economic destiny is not written in stone. To see how things could have been different, and perhaps could still change, it's instructive to compare Russia with a few places that took alternate paths. Let's imagine a what-if scenario. What if Russia had managed its treasure more like others who turned resource curses into blessings? Let's play out an alternate history in our minds. Imagine Russia, with all its immense natural wealth, but governed with the foresight of Norway, the communal benefit mindset of Alaska, and the innovative spirit that retains its brightest minds. What would that Russia look like today? Possibly a truly rich Russia, a country as prosperous as it is vast. Case 1. Norway, the prudence of a pension fund. In the 1960s, Norway discovered oil in the North Sea. It was a poor country at the time by Western European standards. But instead of succumbing to the resource curse, Norway's leaders did something unusual. They set strict rules to manage the oil boom responsibly. They created a sovereign wealth fund, essentially a giant savings account, to invest oil revenues for the long-term benefit of society. Today, that fund, the Government Pension Fund Global, is the largest such fund in the world, worth about 20 trillion Norwegian kroner, roughly $1.8 trillion as of late 2024. To break that down, Norway's 5.6 million people collectively own this nest egg. It works out to about $320,000 per Norwegian citizen saved up for the future. The fund owns over 1% of all global stocks, generating more income for Norway each year than the country's oil exports themselves. Norway's prudent management turned finite oil wells into a permanent source of national wealth. Now imagine if Russia had done the same. Russia earned huge oil and gas revenues, especially in the 2000s, a period sometimes called Russia's oil boom. If a significant chunk of that money had been saved and invested rather than spent or lost, Russia too could have a massive sovereign wealth fund by now. In reality, Russia did establish reserve funds, like the National Welfare Fund, which by early 2022 held around $180 billion. Helpful, but a fraction of Norway's on a per capita basis, and often tapped for emergency measures. What if Russia had a fund of, say, $1 trillion, shielded from corruption and politics, earning dividends to stabilize the economy? With nearly 20 times Norway's population, Russia might not reach $320,000 per person, but even $50,000 per citizen in a fund would transform the economic security of every Russian family. Such a fund could invest in infrastructure, education, or cushion every retiree's pension. Instead, much of Russia's oil windfall was spent in the moment, some on improving living standards, yes, but plenty on white elephant projects and enriching insiders. Just as important as saving money is how you spend it. Norway also used oil wealth to fund universal healthcare, top-notch education, and infrastructure, laying the foundation for a diversified economy. Norway today regularly ranks near the top of global living standards, with GDP per capita around $90,000, one of the world's highest, and low inequality. Russia, by contrast, spends a lot on its military and subsidies for state-owned companies, but underinvests in public services like healthcare. Russia's health expenditure per capita is around 2/10 of Norway's, for example. The what-if is stark. Had Russia transformed its natural wealth into human capital, better schools, better health, innovation, it could be as wealthy and developed as some of the richest Western nations. Case 2. Alaska, sharing the wealth directly. On a smaller scale, consider the U.S. state of Alaska. Case 2. Alaska, sharing the wealth directly. On a smaller scale, consider the U.S. state of Alaska. In 1976, Alaska's constitution was amended to create the Alaska Permanent Fund, designed to take a portion of oil revenues and invest them for future generations, not so different in spirit from Norway's approach. The unique twist in Alaska is the Permanent Fund Dividend, PFD. Every year, a portion of the fund's earnings is paid out directly to each and every Alaskan resident. It's essentially a guaranteed annual bonus just for living there, funded by oil. Over decades, this dividend has varied from a few $100s to a few $1,000s per person. As of 2019, the fund was about $64 billion in size and paid out roughly $1,600 per resident annually on average, some years more, some less. In 2022, with high oil prices, the dividend spiked. Each eligible Alaskan got $3,284, the largest payout ever. This policy ensures that when oil profits rise, every ordinary family feels a benefit, a stark contrast to most places where oil wealth might only enrich company owners or the government. Now imagine if Russia had an Alaska-style dividend for its citizens. With far greater oil and gas output than Alaska, the payouts could be significant. Even a modest dividend could supplement incomes in poorer regions. It would also create public pressure to manage the resource fund sustainably, since millions of citizens would directly notice if their yearly check shrank due to mismanagement. This kind of inclusive wealth sharing never took root in Russia. Instead, as we've discussed, the gains were concentrated. The what-if scenario is tantalizing. If every Russian got even a couple $1,000s per year from the nation's resource wealth, it could have dramatically reduced poverty and boosted local economies across the vast country.